Hello, Nnamdi Ehirim. Thank you for joining us on the One Read podcast today. It's great to have you with us.
Hello, Chibuka. Glad to be with you guys today.
So, congratulations on the publication of Prince of Monkeys. How do you feel having your book as the October book of the month for One Read?
Man, it feels great. Like it's always great to have an opportunity to reach out to like new audiences in whatever way. So whatever medium I'm connecting to readers, whatever medium my work is made available to readers is always pretty interesting. And I think especially like in this particular format, this is probably the first time my book has been made in this particular format, so that's also been pretty interesting to see as well.
Tell us a little bit about the writing of this book. How did you decide that you wanted to tell this story, and what informed your choice of a title, the character choices, and the plot?
So that's a very, very hard question, right? It's harder than you would assume, especially because there was really no method to it. I began writing this book a couple of years ago in 2014, and at the time I was doing my undergraduate program at Covenant University, and I started writing it at the same time I was writing my final year project, which was a lot of engineering research. And just at the time I needed a distraction, I needed an outlet, so I just started free writing. So it was a combination of, I was pulling from previous work I'd done, previous stories I'd done, previous characters I'd been working on but I hadn't developed into stories yet, things that were happening at the time. That was the run up to the 2015 elections, which was very, very, I wouldn't use the word controversial, but very polarizing. So that also informed a lot of the politics of the book. And at the same time as well, I was pretty much getting like disillusioned with organized religion. So I was also just trying to read more about like different worldviews, and that also informed a lot of the religious conversations in the book. So a lot of it was very, very unstructured. There was no, I mean, like when you're speaking to people, right, and they say you should prepare to write a book, they will say outline and develop your characters on separate pages, like character bibles and whatnot. There was none of that for me, man. It was just vibes. Like it was just literally, oh yes, I have an hour free today. What am I going to write today? That kind of stuff.
And what informed your choice of the title, Prince of Monkeys?
So it's an excerpt from a passage in the book where one of the characters, Mendos, goes on a monologue, but the origin for it is I had written it originally as a poem. That was probably like my first and only proper attempt at poetry. It was for a poetry competition. It was for an Independence Day poetry competition, and I wrote that. And yeah, I don't think much came of it. I can't remember, but so like I said, to answer the previous question, I was pulling from like different stuff. So I ended up like pulling from that and adding it to the book, and I figured, this will make a pretty catchy title. So it stuck.
Oh, wow. It's a very interesting title, I must say. And so far, since your book has been out in the world, I mean, it's been published in the United States of America, what has been the reception from the audience and from, the general reading public?
Man, that's the fun part. That's the fun part, like just searching for the title of the book on Twitter, or like searching for reviews and ratings on Goodreads and on Instagram, and just generally speaking with people and getting their feedback, right? I feel for me like that has been the most rewarding part of the entire process. And I mean, it's literature, it's art, so definitely it will make people feel different types of ways. I've met people who said they absolutely loved it. Like, I think my favorite responses in terms of like actual people who read it reaching out to me was, I remember some lady from somewhere in the US who reached out to me saying she had gotten the book and she had read it, and I think from her childhood she'd never been able to walk. She'd been in a wheelchair from childhood, and she said she had obviously like never been to Africa, and she had also never read a book about Africa like prior. So but she read the book and it was just so informative and educative, and also just an interesting literary read, and she felt like she had to reach out to me to thank me for putting the book out into the world. And I also remember there was also this girl from, so she like reached out to my publishers to forward the letter to me. And then there was also this lady from, I think, Ethiopia or so, who said she looked on my website, she couldn't find any. She looked for me on social media, she couldn't find me. So she found me on LinkedIn. Because on my bio it says like I was at a particular business school. So she found my profile, found me on LinkedIn, and then she sent me a message on LinkedIn saying how the book moved her in certain ways, especially like regarding the politics of it, and the politics of our nation back home. She was Ethiopian, but she was based in the US. So I mean, there's been that type of feedback, and for me, I think I'd say I also really enjoyed the feedback from just people who are here in Nigeria, like people who I'd say are my peers. So people who are in the same frame of mind, or were in the same frame of mind I was when I wrote the book, who experienced the same political and religious dilemmas and stuff like that, right? Just hearing their opinion, hearing their feedback, and just having other conversations like grow off as an offshoot from the passages in the book. And on the other hand, there's also like been the really, really scathing reviews, like the people who would say, oh yes, this is absolute dog shit, right? I mean, that's fair as well, and that's also as valid as the praise. But I think the summary of it all would be to say literary opinion is very, very arbitrary. Like there are no standard rules or guidelines, and people would love certain things that other people absolutely hate about your book, and vice versa as well. So really just put out the work that speaks to you and represents your voice, and inshallah, just trust in the work.
And speaking about the political nature of the book, you chose to examine a time in Nigeria's history characterized by military rule, oppression. And reading this book in October 2020, it's almost as if you had some foreknowledge of what would be happening in the country right now. Just tell us a bit about why you chose to explore this particular theme and how it feels having written this book 4 years ago and finding ourselves in this nearly the exact same situation.
The funny thing is I one of the major reasons for setting the book in the time it was setting was to avoid questions like this. so I mean, like I said, I wrote it I started writing it in 2014, leading up to the 2015 elections, and I finished writing it in January 2016. So obviously the elections that happened, people had been elected already. We are still seeing like early stage, I'd say, results of their show of leadership. Yeah, exactly, consequences. So, but all through that stage, what I didn't want was to write a book that was particularly critical of a certain person or leader. I felt if I situated it in the present, it would have been looked at as like targeted at a particular person or leader. And I think even though like criticism of particular persons and leaders are valid, right? I didn't want it to get lost in all of that, because it is largely a critique of a system as opposed to individual people, because I wrote it set in the late 80s, early 90s military rule. A lot of the political conversations, a lot of the criticisms are still as valid now in 2020, 20 years into our democratic existence, right? So it's more of, it was me looking to criticize a system more or less as opposed to actual people. And yeah, it just shows how much growth we haven't made and how much growth there is to make. And also I think another thing that informed, from a creative standpoint, another thing that informed the setting was, I also felt like that particular time frame in our literary history was very, very unwritten about. We have things from the 60s and the 70s, but going into the 80s and 90s, like largely also because of the military regime and the stronghold they had on censorship, right? There was minimal creative output. So resuming in the 2000s, when the Chimamandas and co started like putting out work, right? It was also like of their own time and era, but there was a bit of a vacuum in the sense that between the 80s and 90s, like that very, very heated part of our history, not a lot of work interrogated like that particular era. So for me, it was a soft spot. It was somewhere to tackle that I felt like a lot of people hadn't tackled before. And so if someone is saying, oh yes, let's check out books that discuss such and such in this era, like it would be easy to point that I recommend.
You also touch on the theme of police brutality and illegal detention in a way, and I'm just gonna read a quote from a passage in the book where you say, "Injustice is only injustice when it happened in the past. There's no judge to decide justice in the present, just witnesses who are as powerless as the victims." And it feels so apt for such a time like this when we've just witnessed the End SARS protests and the response of the government to that. What's your whole feeling about that?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I think it's still a moment that we're all living very present in. I think everyone was hugely affected by the entire like past few weeks, like the protests, the momentum, the push for reform and change, the tragic loss of lives and all of that, right? And I think particularly the shootings and the incidents, it was particularly harrowing. I think this particular passage also, to provide context, was speaking about the illegal detention of people in prison, right? And how there really isn't anyone in the present, like in real time when it's happening, when people are being like locked up illegally and detained illegally for whatever reasons, and they're deprived of their basic rights. There almost is never like a proper way or a proper person who can like stand in their stead or advocate for them and say, oh yes, this is an injustice going on. For the most part, it's always with benefit of hindsight, when you've been locked up for a year and someone comes to look for you, or when someone comes to do prison visitation.
Ouch.
Yeah, exactly, where they will now say, this is an injustice, this person isn't meant to be here, right? It's always with like the benefit of hindsight, saying after all these years this shouldn't have happened. But like in real time, there never really is a way to fight for justice in real time, because a lot of these things happen in the shadows, right? And that's the way power operates, that's the way terror operates as well. But I think this last few weeks has been a turning point, because I don't know if it's for the first time, but for the first time in a long while, we've seen people advocate for justice in the present, in real time. And yes, we are there's still a lot of hindsight advocacy, because when we talk about Akuzu SARS, when we list the name of all the people who have been killed by SARS, a lot of the names we call are people who died last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. But we are also now like being able to raise our voice to advocate for injustice that happen in the present. And we're seeing, even though the progress is slow, we're seeing the needle move closer towards accountability. We're seeing initially it was denial by the government and the army by the state government and the army, and after a few days there was the admittance of, oh yes, we were present, and these people did do the shooting. And hopefully, like, with more pressure, we can move the needle closer towards accountability, and with more organizing and planning as well, we could also not just make sure it's momentary successes. We could build systems around this and say, oh yes, going forward, when there are injustices, this is how we can fight for justice in real time, in the moment. If we see something happening on the road, like, these are the avenues we can use to reach out for justice in the moment, as opposed to letting things deteriorate into had I known, and how could we let this happen.
I just want to skip to the end of the book really quickly, because you mentioned something about how power operates, and I know a lot of people who have read the book would be wondering why you chose that ending for our for the main character Ihechi. And just looking at it in the context of what has been happening, it occurred to me that was a statement on how, when the powers that be, or the rulers of the time, give power temporarily to another person or to a young leader and make that person a figurehead, sometimes if things don't go right, they can withdraw that power and show that person that, look, if you think that you're powerful, then we will show you that we are the ones who actually own the real power. Is that actually what you were going for with that scene, or were you trying to make some other kind of...
I'd say that's definitely a way to look at it. There were many things going on in the scene, but that's definitely an angle. It's like, remember when, like, the previous term, Buhari's first term, where there was a lot of anti-corruption campaigns and fights, and when people start asking how come we're not seeing the signs, the politicians would say because corruption is fighting back. I think that was also a similar moment where Ihechi had realized that he had been hoodwinked, he had been scammed, and the people who the power brokers he had been working for, had not been as transparent as he thought, and he began to question their motives. And when he felt he could challenge power, like, power fought back, right? And the graphic, like the whole chaotic incident of him, like, losing his arm as a punishment, was also very metaphorical of how violently power fights back. Like, regardless of your perceived proximity to power, you are not safe from the violence of power, right? And also, like, going back to one of the conversations he had with Ihechi earlier, where Ihechi was also insisting on, like, a leaderless movement, which is pretty much what we've seen in our entire protest. And he said, there's no name to this cause other than justice. If there is a name, there's something for the enemy to attack and to distort. You give it a name, and they'll spread lies and misconceptions about that name before the truth is done tying its shoes. Just live out the cause, and at worst they'll attack your person, but your cause stays untainted. If there's a name, it becomes a religion or a cult. Then you need a chief priest or a leader everyone can look up to for guidance. And having anyone above equals is brewing egoism and jealousy. Egoism and jealousy mixed together is self-destruction. Without a name, there's freedom to have a parallel structure where everyone learns from each other. No chief priest, no ego, no self-destruction. Yeah, and it's pretty much played out in everything. Like we saw a very leaderless movement. We saw, in quote, forces beyond our control try to look for a leader they could target, they could distort, they could taint. And when they couldn't find that, it turned to misinformation and propaganda to discredit the cause. And we also saw people who also tried to take advantage of the movement, make a personality cult out of it, to be seen as heroes, to be seen as saviors. So all these things are things we are seeing now, but it isn't particularly new in the history of Nigeria. It's not particularly new in the history of world politics. But it just shows the state of things, and how in this our very recent NSAS protest we've managed to step over some of these loopholes.
Well, that's a very good way of putting it. But let's move away from the heavy stuff for a little bit. So, which character did you enjoy writing the most? Even though you've already said that you didn't quite, do the character bibling and all that. But which character is your favorite and why?
My favorite character easily was Zenat. My favorite character easily was Zenat because
I think all of us.
yeah, like because
Speak
she
for
was
all of us.
yeah, like she was full of life. Like she had absolutely no regard for bad vibes. Like she was the ultimate like good vibes champion, right? And it was almost like idealistic how positive she was. And how she really couldn't just be put down by anything. Like her spirit was unquenchable. So that was definitely my easiest character or my favorite character to write. I'd say I also really enjoyed writing EH's mom.
The women are taking the lead.
Yeah. I mean, like I don't know why. I really enjoyed EH's mom because she was also in a way a renegade. She did what she did. She was very like devoted to her religion. She was very devoted to her principles, and she wanted her son like to grow up in a similar way, right? So she was very, very principled, and most of what she did was unpopular, right? The way she lived her life, but she was very, very undeterred of the it. And I think, I mean, looking at it, I'll probably find something I like about each of the characters. There are a lot of things to like about both Effie and Tessie. There are a lot of things to like about Uncle Adore and the way he was this unexpected and unassuming fatherly figure in all their lives. You would say he didn't have like the most physically like domineering personality that fathers tend to have in Nigerian households, but you could see like his influence and the influence of his way of life, his way of thinking on his children and on EHE as well. So yeah, and obviously there's still like the popular Mendos who's like the
idealistic and
yeah,
revolutionary.
like, exactly, figure in the book. And I mean, I wouldn't say I'd say I enjoyed writing him just because he was a conduit for a lot of the more difficult conversations that other characters weren't willing to have. But it was also just because a lot of writing him involved like heavy stuff. It was a bit of a burden writing him than like an enjoyable process.
Oh wow. And what's your writing routine like? Are you a morning person, or do you prefer to wait till all the lights go out?
I'm an at the spirit leads person, so I absolutely like have no fixed schedule. I mean, I definitely could be more productive if I had a fixed schedule, right? But just because of life, like we all are slaves to capitalism and just all the other many other pressures, right? So I just I write when I can. What I do actively is I'm constantly thinking about my stories. So I'm constantly thinking of plot directions of characters, of possible dialogue between the characters, of just different ways. It could be constantly thinking of metaphors I could use, of one-liners, that type of thing. I'm constantly thinking, and I'm constantly noting down. So I note things down everywhere. I DM myself like between my Twitter accounts, and I'm sending myself tweets to store like, oh yeah, that's a catchy line, like this could be bent in this particular way, or I'm taking things down like on my notes. I'm saving voice notes, like screenshotting passages of things I'm reading like on my phone, on my laptop, that type of stuff. Just different modes of archiving, and then when I do sit down in front of the laptop, it's pretty much just putting everything on the mental visual board in front of me, and just like mixing and matching. This would go in well here, and this could go in well there. So at the point where I'm at my desk, is more scientific than artistic.
Speaking of which, what are some of the interesting things that you've read recently? Novels or even articles?
Ooh, let me see some of the interesting things I've read recently. Recently I've been very, very deliberate about what I'm reading, just because I'm working on new work. And as much as we hate to admit it, what we read shapes what we create. So I'm really deliberate and careful about what I'm writing, so as to so I get the kind of mood, I get the kind of vibe, I get the kind of inspiration and direction into like what I'm currently working on. I'd say the most enjoyable thing I've read recently easily is Black Bazaar. um Alan Mabanku. Black Bazaar is easily the most interesting thing I've read recently, just because firstly I like the tone in which it's written. It's very it's not written in like contemporary literature, classic, or like the voice is not like contemporary literature, classic literature. It's more like he's sitting at the bar and telling a story to his homeboys at the bar. So just like a lot of the social analysis, a lot of the social commentary, a lot of the dialogue, like, and just also it's very imperfect, right? So a lot of the self-hate and self-denigration as well is also very true and real, right? A lot of the how the banter is structured between like him and his friends is also very real, and especially the voice I found it really, really interesting. And I mean everything about it is great. The names of the characters, the protagonist is called the botologist for obvious reasons. His wife is original color for obvious reasons. Like it's just a very, very interesting and unusual book, positively unusual.
And what are you currently reading?
I'm currently reading Alama Banco again. I'm reading African Psycho. And what is the book about? Pretty self-explanatory. About an African Psycho. So it's about this guy who absolutely adores this famed serial killer in his who's from the Congo as well. He's from the Congo. He's set in the Congo, and he pretty much lives his life trying to emulate the guy and make him proud, make the dead serial killer proud.
The pandemic has affected all of us in different ways. How has, I mean, we're sort of coming to a close of national lockdowns, and things are going back to normal more or less. But how did the pandemic affect your life as a writer, and what has changed?
I'd say, to be honest, as a writer, the pandemic was the net positive. The
Okay.
pandemic itself, right? I'd say from maybe February to June-ish, that was probably like the most productive, creatively productive phase of my life, because there was a lot of isolation. There was a lot of like me just somersaulting in my own head, and after somersaulting for 1 hour in my head, like you get exhausted. I'm like, oh yeah, what next to do? Open the laptop, like put down some words, and so the current piece I'm working on is way less political, way less religious. It's more personal. It's more human relationships than social commentary, right? So it also afforded me time and space to do a lot of personal reflection, which informed a lot of the stories, a lot of the emotion I put into the book. So yeah, definitely was a net positive. The funny part is, going into the start of the year, I had begun work on something totally different, something more in the line of Prince of Monkeys, pretty much the same social, political, or religious dynamic, but set in the near future. So also again avoiding the contemporary present, but set in the near future. And then I think by the end of January, I was sure I wanted to do what I'm working on at the moment, and I knew it was urgent. It's something I had to do in the moment, so I put off the other thing that I was working on, and so far so good. I'm happy with the progress I've made.
That's good to know. So, what did you hope that readers would take away from Prince of Monkeys?
Man, not hard. I think I wanted people to close the final page and be like, that was a good book. That wasn't a waste of my time. There were a few catchy lines in there, like that's a memorable character. Like for me, like I wanted people to love and appreciate its literary merit primarily. Every other thing is secondary. A lot of the ideas in the book were given understand from the standpoint of opinion, right? It wasn't me saying this is right or this is wrong. Everyone had like contradictory opinions. So I don't expect anyone to come and say, oh yes, this is because of this book, this is my stance, because the book preaches many different alternatives to social activism, right? So for me, like, that's the less important part. I really wanted people to have like a good literary read primarily, and I hope I achieved that. So,
I'm sure you did. Thank you so much for joining us today.
okay, then see you sometime soon. Take care.
Prince of Monkeys is now available for sale from Ouida Books and most bookstores around you in Nigeria.